heart of downtown Chicago turned into a battlefield in broad daylight. Michigan Avenue, once a symbol of prosperity and high-end shopping, was transformed into a smash-and-grab war zone. It began with cell phone footage circulating online. A vehicle rammed straight into the glass facade of a Louis Vuitton store, sending shards flying across the sidewalk. Within seconds, dark-clad figures rushed inside, emerging with armfuls of luxury goods. They sprinted toward waiting vehicles as pedestrians shouted in shock, filming the chaos. It was fast, coordinated, and deliberate, leaving behind a trail of shattered glass, overturned displays, and an atmosphere of raw fear. This was not an isolated incident. Just blocks away, another crew hit a Rolex boutique, hacking through display cases with axes and dragging away timepieces worth thousands of dollars each. Witnesses described the looters as brazen, striking in full view of commuters leaving work. Surveillance cameras captured them bolting into a getaway SUV, sparking a high-speed chase down the Dan Ryan Expressway. Police intercepted the vehicle only after it crashed in Englewood, leaving stolen goods scattered across the street. By nightfall, several suspects were in custody, but the damage was already done. The Rolex store gutted, the city's image scarred. The violence didn't stop at luxury retailers. On State and Lake, looters smashed through the windows of Potbelly's, a popular sandwich shop. They ripped open registers, dragged out coolers, and left chaos in their wake. By the time officers could seal off downtown, at least 3 distinct smash-and-grab incidents stretched from the Magnificent Mile to Lakeshore Drive. Multiple vehicles were overturned, several people injured, and dozens of businesses shuttered behind hastily nailed boards. Yet the sense of insecurity spread faster than police could respond. What made these events especially alarming was the timing. This wasn't the dead of night or a hidden corner of the city. These were prime hours in one of the most heavily patrolled commercial districts in America. Business owners described the coordinated raids as surgical strikes that left them reconsidering whether to stay open at all. Some admitted to reporters they were traumatized enough to consider closing permanently, not because of declining customers, but because of the looming fear that the next wave of looters could arrive at any moment. Critics asked the uncomfortable question, how could such brazen robberies unfold in broad daylight in a city with one of the nation's largest police forces without immediate intervention? The answer lay not only in the crimes themselves, but in the deeper fractures running through Chicago. The city was already grappling with political tensions over immigration enforcement, sanctuary policies, and federal intervention. The looting simply poured gasoline on a fire already burning beneath the surface. Social media accelerated the crisis. Hashtags spread at lightning speed, with users declaring that Chicago had become lawless and a war zone. Clips of men in masks rushing from storefronts dominated national broadcasts, creating a narrative that the city's leaders were failing to maintain even basic order. For the rest of America, Chicago was not just suffering isolated crimes, it was collapsing into chaos. The fear wasn't just about crime, it was about symbolism. These attacks struck at iconic brands, Louis Vuitton, Rolex, high-profile chains that represented wealth and prestige. Their destruction became shorthand for a city unable to protect its crown jewels. For ordinary Chicagoans, the message was chilling. If looters could storm the Magnificent Mile in broad daylight, what neighborhood could possibly feel safe? The first night after the spree ended with downtown's once glittering storefronts boarded up, sirens echoing in the distance, and residents debating whether they were witnessing mere thefts or the unraveling of civic order itself. In the days to come, those broken windows would become more than a criminal incident. They would spark a political firestorm, one that pitted City Hall against the White House and left Chicago standing as a battleground, not just for looters, but for America's bitterest divisions. The broken glass on Michigan Avenue quickly gave way to broken trust in City Hall. In the hours following the looting spree, Chicago's political climate turned toxic. Critics wasted no time in blaming local leadership, accusing the mayor's office of allowing chaos to fester in one of America's most visible cities. Social media amplified every rumor and half-truth. One viral phrase, "let them loot," was falsely attributed to city leaders, but it spread with such speed that many took it as fact. To thousands of residents already rattled by the violence, it felt like confirmation that City Hall didn't care, or worse, was complicit. Mayor Brandon Johnson, already a polarizing figure, found himself at the center of a storm. His administration insisted that looting was unacceptable, but his critics accused him of failing to act decisively. By the end of that week, the debate was no longer just about stolen handbags or gutted storefronts. It had become a referendum on Johnson's leadership, his stance on immigration, and his ability to confront crime. Some business owners went further, calling for outside intervention, arguing that the city was incapable of defending itself. President Donald Trump seized the moment. From the White House, he delivered sharp criticism, branding Chicago a mess and calling Johnson grossly incompetent. His promise was blunt: "We're going to make our cities very, very safe. Chicago will be next." For Trump's supporters, it was a welcome sign of federal muscle. For his critics, it was a dangerous escalation, a threat to override local authority with sweeping federal power. Either way, the spotlight was now on Chicago, framed as the front line in America's struggle over law and order. The mayor's office pushed back fiercely, accusing Trump of exploiting the crisis for political theater. Johnson argued that deploying the National Guard, as Trump suggested, would inflame tensions between police and residents rather than resolve them. His administration stressed that under U.S. law, the president could not federalize Illinois' Guard without state approval, but Trump's words struck a chord with those demanding immediate action. The image of boarded-up boutiques and luxury brands under siege made Chicago look like a city on its knees, and the president's promise to restore order resonated with anxious Americans across the country. Within the city itself, the debate exposed deep ideological rifts. Right-wing commentators accused City Hall of prioritizing progressive sanctuary policies over public safety, portraying the administration as protecting criminals more than businesses. Left-wing activists countered that focusing on broken luxury stores ignored the broader realities of poverty and inequality. The result was a city divided along fault lines, with neither side willing to concede ground. The looting had become more than a crime, it was now a political weapon. In town halls and televised debates, anger spilled over. Residents demanded accountability, while activists accused officials of scapegoating vulnerable communities. Johnson attempted to navigate both sides, insisting looting was intolerable, but blaming failures in state prosecution and federal policy for allowing repeat offenders back onto the streets. This attempt at balance satisfied no one. The right accused him of weakness, the left of betrayal, the middle saw only paralysis. The longer the debate raged, the more Chicago's leadership looked out of control. For Trump, this presented an opening. By portraying Chicago as proof of what happens when progressive policies collide with urban crime, he set the stage for direct federal intervention. And when the mayor's attempts to calm tensions failed, Washington prepared to act. What began with smashed storefronts had morphed into a battle over sovereignty itself. Who truly controlled Chicago's streets, the mayor's office, or the federal government? The answer would come not in words, but in convoys of federal vehicles and coordinated raids. Downtown's shattered glass had set off a chain reaction, and the city was about to experience its most aggressive federal presence in decades. Before the glass on Michigan Avenue could even be swept away, federal convoys rolled in. Long before dawn, unmarked SUVs and armored trucks appeared on Chicago's streets, their lights flashing as heavily armed officers moved with precision. This was Operation Midway Blitz, a Trump-ordered initiative led by Homeland Security and ICE, targeting what federal officials described as dangerous criminals with open charges or convictions. But the scope quickly blurred. To many residents, the operation felt less like a focused law enforcement action and more like a citywide show of force. Trump himself framed the raids as essential. Chicago, he declared, had become a sanctuary for criminals and could no longer manage its own security. His message was clear: if local leaders could not restore order, Washington would. In this sense, Operation Midway Blitz was more than a policing campaign, it was a political statement. ICE agents fanned out across the city and into the suburbs, staking out neighborhoods in Evanston, Elgin, and Des Plaines. Armored SUVs boxed in vehicles at gas stations and outside convenience stores, while helicopters circled overhead, casting searchlights onto quiet streets. Families awoke to pounding knocks on doors, sirens blaring, and armed men in tactical gear demanding entry. Some raids targeted individuals with criminal records, but others seemed indiscriminate. The rule quickly became, if you were found to be undocumented, you were taken. Federal officials insisted the operation was carefully planned and narrowly targeted, but immigrant families heard a different message: no one was safe. The mayor of Evanston even confirmed that his office had been contacted by state authorities, warning that his suburb could be next. This announcement, though intended to prepare, instead fueled widespread panic. Residents interpreted it as a sign that the raids could happen anywhere at any time. Parents kept children home from school, fearing checkpoints. Workers skipped shifts, afraid of being detained on their commute. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem personally traveled to Chicago to underline Washington's resolve. Appearing alongside agents, she declared the raids a necessary defense of American law, insisting the scales of justice are equally applied to everybody. But critics saw her presence as political theater, a calculated move to put a national spotlight on the administration's hardline stance. Videos of her standing near armored vehicles in suburban neighborhoods went viral, sparking outrage among those who believed the federal government was escalating fear rather than addressing crime. Reports indicated that within days, hundreds of migrants had been arrested. Some indeed had pending charges, others did not. Federal officials declined to give precise numbers or timelines, only stressing that the operation would continue until further notice. This ambiguity added to the climate of fear. When asked whether non-criminal undocumented residents were being swept up, ICE admitted that anyone encountered during an operation could be detained regardless of their status as a target. For immigrant rights groups, this was proof of mission creep. What had been sold as a focused crackdown on violent criminals now looked like a broad sweep of vulnerable families. Activists staged protests outside federal offices, forming human chains and demanding transparency. They accused the administration of exploiting Chicago's unrest to wage an immigration crackdown disguised as public safety. Yet for many Americans watching from afar, the images of federal convoys rumbling through Chicago neighborhoods were reassuring. They saw a government finally imposing order where local leadership had failed. To them, Operation Midway Blitz was a bold demonstration that no city, even one declaring itself a sanctuary, was beyond the reach of federal law. The reality on the ground was far more complicated. Every helicopter hovering over suburban rooftops, every armored vehicle parked outside a corner store drove a wedge deeper between residents and authorities. Chicago was not only grappling with looters and political battles anymore, it was becoming a test case for how far Washington could go in asserting control over a city that resisted. And soon the consequences of that test would begin to spill out in ways no one in Washington or Chicago could fully control. The early days of Operation Midway Blitz were chaotic, but what followed was even more alarming. As federal agents intensified their presence, mistakes began to surface, mistakes that carried devastating human costs. The first warning came from Elgin, a quiet suburb where residents woke before dawn to the sound of helicopters circling overhead. Federal agents stormed a home and dragged 5 people outside in handcuffs, but by midday it was revealed that 2 of them were U.S. citizens. They had been cuffed, humiliated on their front lawn, and released only after producing identification. The damage, however, was already done. Videos of the raid spread online, fueling outrage and a new narrative. If even citizens could be caught in these dragnets, no one was safe. Then came Des Plaines. Outside a 7-Eleven, a landscaping truck was boxed in by black SUVs. Federal agents yanked 3 men from the vehicle with tasers drawn in full view of children in the parking lot. One of the brothers was struck in the face with a stun gun and hospitalized. His family later confirmed he was not undocumented, not a criminal, and not even charged. He was born in Chicago, yet ICE held him for hours before finally letting him go. The images of an American citizen writhing on the pavement while agents restrained him became a rallying cry for activists who declared the raids not a law enforcement action but an engineered crisis. The backlash was immediate. Activists surrounded ICE facilities, waving upside-down American flags and chanting for the raids to end. Community leaders accused the federal government of weaponizing fear rather than upholding justice. If citizens can be grabbed, nobody is safe. One protester declared a phrase that ricocheted across social platforms and into nightly news broadcasts. For immigrant families, the fear was paralyzing. Parents refused to send children to school. Workers disappeared mid-shift to avoid possible checkpoints. Neighborhoods that had long prided themselves on resilience suddenly felt under siege. Federal officials downplayed the incidents, calling them rare mistakes in high-pressure environments. But the public saw them differently. Mistakes caught on camera don't feel rare, they feel deliberate. And once images of American citizens being wrongfully detained spread nationwide, they undermined the administration's assurances that Operation Midway Blitz was a carefully targeted campaign. Instead, the raids looked sweeping, indiscriminate, and punitive. The political fallout was swift. Illinois leaders accused Washington of destabilizing neighborhoods to score political points. Governor J.B. Pritzker blasted Trump for actively fanning the flames of division, warning that the raids were terrifying families rather than stopping looters. Trump's allies countered by pointing to Chicago's sanctuary policies, arguing that they allowed violent offenders to thrive unchecked. Each side hardened its stance, and ordinary residents found themselves caught between dueling narratives: fear of looters on one hand, fear of federal agents on the other. The human toll deepened the crisis. Parents texted warnings in community group chats, urging neighbors to avoid certain streets where agents were reportedly stationed. Workers skipped paychecks to stay home. Churches and advocacy groups scrambled to organize safe spaces and legal hotlines. Meanwhile, footage of armored SUVs circling suburban neighborhoods at dawn reinforced the sense that Chicago was under occupation. For many residents, the looters were no longer the primary fear federal agents were. And yet, for those demanding law and order, the raids represented the federal government finally imposing discipline where City Hall had failed. Supporters framed the mistakes as collateral damage in a necessary war. Opponents called them a betrayal of constitutional rights. The tension left Chicagoans asking the most fundamental question: who was truly being protected and who was being targeted? By this stage, the operation was no longer simply about crime. It had become a referendum on justice itself, whether it was blind or whether it was being wielded as a political weapon. The more blurred the lines became, the more the city descended into anger and distrust. And Chicago's crisis was about to escalate even further, as the man leading these raids, Gregory Bovino, introduced his own aggressive playbook. When Gregory Bovino arrived in Illinois, the tone of Operation Midway Blitz shifted overnight. Bovino, a veteran Border Patrol commander, was well known for his aggressive turn and burn style raids in Los Angeles, where crews swept parking lots, construction sites, and even car washes, arresting anyone who looked like a laborer without hesitation. Now he had been brought into Chicago, a Midwestern sanctuary hub, to oversee federal enforcement on an unprecedented scale. His presence alone signaled that the White House intended to double down, not de-escalate. Almost immediately, the scope of the operation widened. What ICE had initially described as targeted actions against violent criminals began to look more like broad sweeps. Families reported agents staking out courthouses, gas stations, and even schools. Raids appeared less about precision and more about saturation, hitting multiple neighborhoods in rapid succession, overwhelming communities with manpower and fear. Bovino himself boasted on his social media account, "Well, Chicago, we've arrived. Operation at Large is here." It was a chilling message that suggested this was no longer just about Chicago. It was a test case for the rest of the country. Two separate federal operations soon overlapped in Illinois ICE's Midway Blitz and Bovino's newly minted at-large campaign. The doubling of manpower also doubled confusion. Residents described seeing convoys in neighborhoods far removed from crime hotspots, while activists noted that arrests now included not only undocumented migrants with records, but also day laborers, students, and even legal residents caught in the dragnet. Suddenly, entire communities felt as if they were under siege. To Bovino's defenders, this was the only way to restore control. They argued that Chicago's sanctuary status had handcuffed police, emboldened criminals, and forced federal authorities to act aggressively. Every raid was framed as a strike against lawlessness, every convoy as a reassurance that Washington was serious about safety. But critics saw something far more sinister: an expansion of federal policing that blurred legal boundaries and normalized tactics once reserved for the border. The psychological toll was immense. Activists patrolled neighborhoods starting before dawn, alerting families to the presence of federal vehicles. Schools reported lower attendance, especially among immigrant students whose parents feared they might be targeted. Employers struggled to keep shifts staffed as workers disappeared without notice. In effect, Bovino's tactics paralyzed everyday life in entire communities. Meanwhile, national commentators seized on the optics. Right-leaning media portrayed Chicago as proof of sanctuary policies gone wrong, praising the raids as a model to be replicated nationwide. Left-leaning outlets highlighted the images of armored vehicles in quiet suburbs, warning that constitutional rights were being trampled in the name of political theater. The battle over Chicago had officially become a proxy war for America's deepest divisions. The mayor's office, already embattled, now faced near-constant protests outside City Hall. State leaders accused Washington of importing Los Angeles-style raids to the Midwest without consent, treating Chicago like occupied territory. Federal officials countered by pointing to the city's crime statistics and high-profile looting incidents, insisting they had no choice. Each side hardened, leaving ordinary residents trapped in a climate of fear and uncertainty. By week's end, Chicagoans had begun to grasp the larger stakes. This wasn't simply about looting or immigration. If Bovino could normalize such sweeping raids in Chicago, other cities, New York, Philadelphia, even Washington, D.C. could be next. Sanctuary policies would mean little if federal convoys could operate freely in defiance of local governments. The city was no longer just dealing with a crime wave. It was caught in the crosshairs of a national experiment in law enforcement, with Trump's administration testing just how far federal power could reach into America's urban centers. The message was unmistakable. Chicago wasn't merely a battleground for looters and law enforcement. It was now the proving ground for the future of federal intervention in American cities. And with tensions rising on both sides, the next step threatened to push the city past its breaking point. By the time Chicago entered its second week of crisis, the atmosphere felt less like an American city and more like a city under siege. Boarded up storefronts stretched across Michigan Avenue, while the low thrum of helicopters echoed over suburbs like Elgin and Des Plaines. Federal convoys roamed the streets with a persistence that no one in Illinois had witnessed in decades. Calls for the National Guard grew louder, with some aldermen insisting it was the only way to secure shopping districts and restore public confidence. Others, however, warned that such a deployment would inflame tensions, further transforming Chicago into a militarized war zone. President Trump leaned into the imagery, repeatedly describing Chicago as a war that needed to be won. His allies echoed the sentiment, portraying the city as proof of what happens when progressive sanctuary policies meet unchecked crime. The rhetoric struck a nerve nationwide. Commentators began openly asking whether the United States was prepared to deploy military forces onto its own streets to quell domestic unrest. For many, Chicago was no longer just a local issue. It had become the stage for a larger question of how far federal power should reach in the name of order. On the ground, the human cost mounted. Parents texted warnings through neighborhood chat groups, instructing one another to avoid certain blocks where convoys had been spotted. Employers complained of vanished workers' shifts left half-staffed as families hunkered down in fear. Schools saw attendance dip as children stayed home, their parents unwilling to risk exposure to federal checkpoints. Ordinary Chicagoans were caught in a vice, afraid of looters who might return, yet equally fearful of agents who might mistake them for criminals. The line between protection and persecution blurred more with each passing day. Activists, meanwhile, intensified their resistance. Human chains formed outside ICE facilities, protesters clashed with riot police, and upside-down flags waved across downtown. Their message was simple: federal forces were destabilizing communities, not saving them. State officials echoed the anger. Governor J.B. Pritzker accused the Trump administration of political theater, claiming the raids were designed more to generate headlines than to deliver justice. He fans the flames of division, Pritzker declared, warning that the show of force risked tearing neighborhoods apart rather than addressing the root causes of unrest. Yet the federal government showed no sign of backing down. Officials confirmed that ICE was being reinforced with agents from the DEA, ATF, and U.S. Marshal Service, ensuring the operation could continue indefinitely. For the Trump administration, Chicago was a litmus test. If federal forces could operate unchallenged here, they could do the same in any sanctuary city that resisted Washington's authority. For Chicagoans, however, the crisis was deeply personal. Behind every smashed storefront was a business owner wondering if survival was even possible. Behind every raid was a family debating whether to send their children to school or step outside without fear of disappearance. And behind every political speech was the uneasy realization that Chicago had become a pawn in a national struggle over identity, security, and power. As winter loomed, the city's future remained uncertain. The last storefront smashed on Michigan Avenue had been more than a robbery, it was a warning. Chicago now stood as the front line of America's internal battles, a place where law enforcement politics and community trust collided violently. Whether the city would recover or sink deeper into turmoil depended not only on the arrests made or the raids conducted, but on whether leaders could bridge the divides that the crisis had exposed. For now, the question lingered: was Chicago witnessing a temporary upheaval or the new reality of urban America in the age of federal intervention? The chaos that began with brazen smash-and-grab robberies on Michigan Avenue quickly spiraled into a defining crisis for Chicago. Luxury boutiques and local businesses alike were devastated, and the violence became a symbol of civic failure broadcast nationwide. President Trump seized the moment, branding the city a war zone and launching Operation Midway Blitz, an ICE-led campaign that brought armored convoys, helicopters, and mass arrests to Chicago's neighborhoods and suburbs. What followed was a storm of confusion and fear. Federal raids swept up hundreds, including U.S. citizens wrongfully detained, sparking outrage and protests. Under Gregory Bovino's command, the operation expanded into broad sweeps that disrupted daily life across immigrant communities, transforming Chicago into a test case for aggressive federal policing in sanctuary cities. As storefronts were boarded up and families hid indoors, the political battle raged. Trump's allies praised the crackdown as restoring order, while Illinois leaders condemned it as political theater that destabilized neighborhoods. Activists and residents alike felt caught between looters and federal agents, with neither side offering true safety. Chicago now stands as a warning. When politics turns policing into a battlefield, the line between protection and persecution can vanish overnight.